Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. I have to confess that I had hoped when we began these particular programs in the light of the lockdown and the light of COVID-19 that by now we probably would have completed the cycle. Sadly, the cycle does not seem to be ending anytime soon, and the pandemic continues, although mercifully, if the figures are anything to go by, at least we may have got to the tail end of the second wave. We'll get there. And so these particular programs have tried to help people through the medical, legal, and economic complexities, consequences, and implications of what is a once-in-a-century pandemic, hopefully a once-in-a-century, totally unprecedented. And we have concentrated on these particular themes for the obvious reasons. And I'm very delighted to welcome Busi Mavuso, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Business Leadership, which is a sheer delight for me. It's obviously important because business has a really important role to play here. It is perfectly obvious that given the pandemic of the kind we've got, the economic consequences thereof, the challenges of the rollout of the vaccine, this cannot be accomplished alone by one sector, whether it be the state or the private sector, but by the country in a national effort to, in a sense, reconstruct our society, both medically and economically. Busi, thank you so much for joining us. And I wonder whether I could start, because you've been fairly vocal about a whole range of issues, and rightly so. But perhaps let's start with the economy. I mean, we now in 2021, the vaccine, with best will in the world, for the vast majority of the population is still a way off. And it doesn't seem to me that we've actually yet implemented in any concrete fashion a kind of, if you could call it, economic reconstruction program of the kind that's been promised time and time again. Maybe I've got it wrong, but I'd be particularly interested in your views on that.
Yeah, Judge, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I think you would remember that last year, the president called on all the social partners to actually put together an economic recovery and reconstruction plan, which was going to ensure that we deal with the economic crisis that we're facing as a country. And we indeed did that, at NETLAC, all the social partners came together to put that plan in place. But I guess let's agree that the issue with South Africa has never been not knowing or not understanding what needs to be done, Judge. The issue with South Africa has always been, the lack of implementation. Let's agree that we are where we are as a country because we have failed dismally when it comes to taking action. We have failed dismally when it comes to implementation. We have failed dismally when it comes to the prioritization of issues. Now, when you look at where we are from an economic perspective, let's agree that South Africa has lost its competitiveness. South Africa has lost its position as the investment destination, in the African continent. We've got Ethiopia, we've got Kenya, which have actually overtaken us from a positioning perspective. So we seem to be failing to realize the importance and the agency of implementing some of the reforms that need to be implemented, especially from a policy perspective, so that we can therefore leapfrog our sister countries in Africa and occupy that position as the attractive investment destination in the South African continent. It is actually embarrassing that for an economy that is the most advanced economy in the continent, that we actually have to be competing for that position with your Kenya and your Ethiopia and whatever other smaller economies and less advanced economies than what South Africa is. So if we're talking about an economic recovery and reconstruction program of South Africa, we just need to look at what are some of the things that we've been talking about for the past 3 years, and we just need to implement that. I mean, for instance, if you look at the issue of the spectrum, and the network infrastructure providers, they've been talking about their frustration around accessing the spectrum. We know now, that the spectrum, for instance, was supposed to have been released, was it in September last year, and there were delays in releasing the spectrum, and we're told that it's going to be released in March this year. And once again, we know that there are going to be delays. There's not going to be any releasing of the spectrum. And you just need to look at what exactly are the issues, because we managed to temporarily release the spectrum to deal with the COVID-19 crisis that we're facing, because we are aware that there was going to be a lot of dependency, on the network infrastructure. So I really don't know, Judge, in terms of, what exactly are we dealing with? Is it a leadership issue? Is it a management issue? Is it a decisiveness issue? Is it I really don't know, but yeah.
Well, if you don't know, then a humble interviewer like me certainly doesn't know. But you work. I mean, you've obviously been at NEDLAC. You dealt with government. You know these people. The government people, etc. What do you prescribe? Well, because perhaps let me go back a moment. I'm totally with you, because you're not the first person who's pointed this out to me. Not that it isn't correct. What you say, in my view, is utterly correct. That you and I could probably sit now for the next 25 minutes on the back of a cigarette box, write out all of the issues that are absolutely required for South Africa to start growing at a reasonable rate, and my heart, and an inclusive economy, not an exclusive economy, which embraces 60 million people. But the question is, as they say, talk is cheap, money buys the whiskey. What is it that, if you take spectrum, if you take the IPPs in relation to the electrical situation, the fact that we still bloody well got, let me be blunt, blackouts, lockdown, blackouts and effectively load shedding, as it's called. I mean, for goodness sake, we've known about this for years. What is it that's holding us back? Why can't tomorrow morning or the next day, in a sense, we see any progress? What is, for you, if you were the president of the country, what would you do now?
I think we also have to be aware of the fact that the key contributor to a big part of our issues as a country is diminishing state capacity and leadership. And I think that is a fact. Let's agree that the ANC-led government that you have today is not the ANC-led government that you had 10 years ago. And unfortunately, that is just a fact, from a leadership perspective, from a decisiveness perspective, from a visionary perspective, we are just not dealing with the same crop, of leadership. And it's unfortunate because over the years, the ANC has seemed to be anti-intellectuals, right? So they've decided to take out all the good crop, good caliber people that they had, in government, and they've replaced it with, their friends, right? Who unfortunately, don't know much. It's going to be difficult if you're going to put a finance minister, for instance, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that is what we have in Tito. If you're going to have a finance minister that doesn't have the difference between income and cash, and you expect, that we actually would be able to run a country and would actually come up with solid fiscal policies and would actually be able to make a headway when it comes to that. So leadership is definitely an issue. And let's agree that our leaders, or South Africa is what it is because our leaders are not what they ought to be. I think the president, for instance, has spoken about the issue of getting his ministers to sign agreements, I don't know what they call it, right? Where he can hold them accountable in terms of what are some of the things that you have to deliver by what, period. And I think looking at where we are now, I don't think that those things are yet in place. So there isn't a culture of accountability. There isn't a culture of holding people responsible. I mean, what is really, it doesn't make sense to me is we can't be going out as a country and talk as strongly as we talk on corruption. And then the next thing you have a Ace Mahashule that has been implicated, in what has been implicated in, and you fail to take action, and I think it goes without saying that someone like Ace Mahashule, for instance, should have stepped down from his position. If we want to actually throw our weight and actually put our money where our mouths are, Ace should have been suspended from his position, but that is not happening. Now, when you therefore look at why are we not making the progress? Why is foreign direct investment not coming into the country? Why are local businesses not investing in the country? Why is investment that is supposed to come into the country being cancelled, redirected, or actually being suspended? It is precisely because the business confidence is not what it should be. And the business confidence won't be what it should be because we are failing to make decisions that will contribute to the positive sentiment. So we know that there is a lot of negative sentiment. We've spoken a lot about, some of the policy issues that we need to ensure that we get right. I mean, if people don't know what the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution is going to mean, and as far as property rights is concerned, forget about getting business confidence to what it should be. If people don't understand what your visa regime and your skills regime, which direction that is going to take, forget about getting investment into the country. If you don't have a clear plan from a just energy transition perspective, and you can't even, provide the energy security, that is required for businesses to can produce what they need to produce so that they can be globally competitive, forget about getting, foreign direct investment in the country. So these are all issues that, and what I'm talking about is really economics 101. You actually just need to look at what are some of the levers that I need to pull to be able to leapfrog my economy, to be actually at the position where it needs to be. But we don't seem to be having those decisions. And I'm going back, Judge, to saying that, and when you look at why we can't think clearly about these things, or we can't see some of the things that are really straightforward, or we can't make sense of economics 101, it's the issue of diminishing state capacity and leadership. So let's agree that South Africa is what it is because our leaders are not what they ought to be. I would like to think that great leaders have to become what their country needs them to be at the time. So where we are at the moment, we need decisiveness, we need bold action, we need to actually probably maybe implement some of the reforms that we've been talking about, but have failed to implement. We need to forget about putting at the forefront this issue of trying to unite an ANC that is fundamentally broken. We need to get over that and say, if the strategy of trying to unite the ANC first before fixing the country is not passing, how do I therefore put that at the back burner and put the 59 million South Africans first before putting the ANC first? Because when all is said and done, you are not the president of the ANC, you are the president of South Africa Inc. And I think what you carry with you is the hope of the 59 million South Africans. So unless you can actually get that priority right and that sequencing right from a leadership perspective, then unfortunately we're still going to grapple with the issues that we're grappling with. And unfortunately, where we are now is that South Africa is going to be another failed African state, not because we don't have the means to can actually get ourselves right, but because we are failing to take some of the decisions that we actually should have taken a long time ago.
Well, you've made a lot of statements there, and I think every single one of them I could devote the entire program to. But let me try to, in the confines of time, I am going to come back to make an observation I'd like your comment on in a moment. But let's start with the state. So let's agree, and I think many people listening to you will agree entirely, that in fact, the president himself and some of the ministers who think about this thing very carefully have said the state is totally incapacitated to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. So, but the truth about it is we've got to work with what we've got. And I suppose, tomorrow morning, we're not going to get a whole bunch of new ministers coming in or an entirely different. So is there a sense in which, given the crisis we're in at present, in your view, there is a possibility, and I mean, you guys are at NEDLAC, whereby the business community and the union community, the worker community, realizes we're either going to be in a boat that's going to sink and all of us will drown, or alternatively, we're going to be in a boat that's actually going to get us safely to shore. Is there a sense in which actually government can't do this alone anymore, and one has to, the greater cooperation of civil society of all kinds, absolutely crucial, because because the one thing I suppose we've got to accept is we're not going to change the government in the next day or two, probably not in the next election. I suppose one could say we're not the only country with terrible leadership. You only have to look at the United Kingdom or look what America's gone through. Look at India and Brazil. But the truth about it is that you're right. I mean, we live here. We got to worry about ourselves. So the question is there a sense in which ideologically the idea that, in fact, we can develop a broader sense of participation to bring in the kind of expertise you're talking about? Because let me make this final point to you. I mean, I'm talking to somebody like this. There are lots of people like yourself, I mean, you know, who are in the, if it were not in government, who are unbelievably capable. And the question is, many of them usually dedicated to the same kind of ideals that you and I share. So is there a sense in which government realizes, actually, we need these people very seriously if we're going to get around the problem? Or is the kind of ideological idea of a statist view of the world such that we just can't hope for that?
You know, Judge, the ANC pays, or government pays lip service to bringing in the private sector meaningfully to try and deal with some of the challenges that we face as a country, but they are yet to actually effectively implement it. So they talk about it, you know, but I'm yet to actually see a private sector that is actually being, you know, co-opted into what needs to be done from a government perspective so that we can actually deal with some of the challenges that we need to deal with. Because when you look at some of the challenges that we're facing as a country, they are really elementary. You know, if, for instance, I take a useless example of the failure of government to deliver books, you know, to 9 provinces, you just have to talk to SAP, you know, who makes these deliveries every day to every corner of the country, you know, and really piggyback on their systems, on their processes, and on the intelligence that they've built over time to look at how you actually need to do that effectively. You know, someone made a joke the other day when we were talking about these things, and they were saying that we are talking about the vaccine program, you know, but getting it to the country is going to be one thing. The distribution thereof to every corner of the country is going to be a big problem. And someone made a joke and said, but you know, if you can just get the SAP to deliver the vaccines and you get the government to deliver alcohol, then there you've got your problem solved, because the alcohol will never get anywhere and the vaccines will get everywhere that they need to get, you know, in time. So that is the type of intelligence, you know, that government is actually not leveraging from the private sector. But of course, we know that we are dealing with a long history of a lack of trust deficit between government and business. You know, we know that we're coming from a recent history of a white monopoly capital narrative. You know, we've got our own unfortunate history that we still haven't effectively dealt with. So I wonder if probably some of the things that trip us up as government and business, and some of the things that are constraining us from working together, is our failure to get over, you know, the trust deficit and some of these narratives and some of these views that we hold about each other as the two different parties. Because I guess other than that, I really don't see what is holding us up. We are, for instance, we have agreed that the infrastructure initiative is going to be what is going to turn the economic trajectory of this country, you know, around, you know. But when you look at how we are implementing the public-private partnership to implement the infrastructure project, unfortunately, we are not there yet. And you just have to look at how the government seems to be insisting on the central role that they have to play in delivering some of these things. And it's not just about the infrastructure project. Look at the SOEs, right? We've been talking about, you know, you look at the SAA that is dysfunctional, and we are hell-bent, you know, of continuously, you know, giving it money that is going down the drain. Look at an ESCOM, you know, that is a monopoly, which doesn't have to be. Because when you look at the energy crisis in this country, and if you agree that putting ESCOM at the center of solving the energy crisis is a terrible idea, and it's not going to get us anywhere. And you have the private sector which have said, you know, we are ready and willing to actually produce or generate electricity, and we can generate excess electricity that can actually be fed into the grid. But the issue we're having is that government is not willing to open up the space because they think that they need to play a central role in delivering some of these things. Now, you have a government that doesn't understand that theirs is to facilitate, theirs is to provide a conducive environment within which business has to operate. Government doesn't have to deliver all of these things that are being delivered by some of these SOEs. Now, if you can get that shift in thinking, but that shift is not going to be there, because what lacks in politics today is a conviction of ideas and a conviction of ideals. So you don't have that type of radical thinking. You don't have that type of abstract thinking, of trying to find solutions that are actually going to leapfrog us as a country. Now, as soon as you get that type of thinking, then you will see that our problems are actually not what we make them up to be. These are problems that can be easily solved. If you were to meaningfully bring all the social partners to the table and actually try and get, a holistic solution to them instead of trying to solve for everything yourself as government.
Can I just ask you about that? As I listen, it seems to me that one of the extraordinary things about South Africa is the incredible lack of trust. So, you have made a whole range of very trenchant points about the government's inability, and many people. I mean, weirdly, if I was interviewing COSATU, I suspect they'd say the same thing, reading their statement, for example, on vaccines. But COSATU sort of suspicious of what you guys are up to. You guys are presumably suggesting COSATU still believe far too much in state centralism. The government complains bitterly that business is untransformed and that white monopoly capital is alive and well. How in that, which makes us in a more difficult situation than many other countries, because you've got to have at least some consensus here. And I would have thought it would have been easier, maybe I'm naive, to have a consensus when you're really in trouble. In other words, to put it in metaphorical terms, if bombs are raining around your cities, you don't have an argument about where the fire department should be located. You get a fire department to do the job. And I'm just interested, where, given the interactions you've had, is there somebody listening to this asking that kind of question, saying, is there hope that there is a bridge building exercise so that some level of trust can be developed amongst the three key constituents, so that at least whilst we're in this crisis, we can actually work together and we can argue when in fact we're out of the crisis? Is there such a possibility, or have we got to the point now where literally, if you take the three sides, it's almost impossible to get any agreement on anything?
Yeah, and when you look at where some of the issues are emanating from a trust deficit perspective, you're raising a critical issue of business not being transformed, Judge. And I guess there's not much we can do to argue with that, because the stats are there to actually say business in South Africa is yet to transform. I mean, there is a Commission of Employment Equity report that comes out year after year, and you just have to look at who sits at the C-suites, of business, and who sits at the top leadership and top management. And those are the issues that are actually, making the trust deficit story, a bit more difficult. But then I look at those issues and I say, you already have a BBBE policy, you already have an employment equity policy, and you are lacking to implement it, as government. Now, there is a piece for me around monitoring and evaluation that government actually has to play, which unfortunately at the moment is not playing. We know that for the past, allow me to say, since the Employment Equity Act has really been in place, we have never reached some of the targets, that are contained therein. And yet there is a policy that guides, the employment equity issues of the country. Now, if you're seeing business not transforming and not being compliant to employment equity, to the Employment Equity Act, what are you doing as government? Because that is why we have the policy in the first place. So if government can actually start taking a very tough stance and drawing a line in the sand when it comes to issues of transformation, then we wouldn't be sitting where we're sitting. Because let's agree that sometimes it might be difficult to get the turkey to be excited about Christmas. And I think if you're going to try to get, the private sector to be excited about implementing transformation, earnestly and honestly, then you are not going to, these things can be left to the goodwill, of the private sector. For instance, you actually have to drag them kicking and screaming to transform, and when they don't transform and when they are not compliant, you actually have to hit them very hard. And once you hit a few very hard, then those that come after them will actually therefore start to learn, that we have to implement the employment equity and the transformation policies or else. So you're sitting in an environment where the private sector has learned that whether you implement these things or not, whether you reach these targets or not, it's neither here nor there. Private sector in this country is so arrogant such that it actually budgets for some of these penalties, to say that I won't comply and it's fine, I'll pay whatever penalties. But you have to make the penalties, number one, have to come, because at the moment, they are not even being penalized for not being compliant. So the penalties have to come. And when they come, they actually have to be very hefty. You actually have to hit them where it hurts the most, and not just on the bottom line, but on the top line. Now, if there isn't that type of thinking, if there isn't that type of strong implementation of these policies, then this whole thing is a useless exercise, and we are never going to get through some of the issues and some of the hurdles that we are actually facing as a country. So for me, the government has the power to can actually force the private sector to transform through implementing. I'm not a fan of over-regulation, but where it makes economic sense for the country, because let's agree that you can't go to war with only 10% of your citizens. We can't be a country which is the most unequal society in the world. That doesn't augur well from a transformation perspective, but also from an economic recovery perspective. Because number one, it makes your tax base very thin, and it doesn't matter how much you are saying you are going to raise taxes, because you are already taxing an overburdened tax base. So if you want to grow the tax base, then force the private sector to transform, force the private sector to support SMMEs, force the private sector to bring in these young Black people which are roaming the streets and are causing chaos in the streets, into the employment fold, so that you can start talking a different language. But if government is not spearheading that, if government is not serious about the monitoring and evaluation, then you and I are going to be having the same conversation 5 years down the line, and you just have to look and say, but who is in charge? Who has the power to can actually make the private sector to toe the line? And if the private sector toes the line, then I'm sure we can therefore be a step closer, to probably the issues of the trust deficit and the transformation story that is holding us back as a country.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose my observation to that, just in comment, I would have loved to have had that further debate, is if the project is transformation as opposed to rent, then that's what should be done. Unfortunately, it seems to be much of the policy results in rent seeking and not transformation. The vast majority of people don't get any better.
So if the project is transformation versus?
Transformation is different to rent seeking. Rent seeking privileges a few people who make a lot of money. A transformation is a complete reconstruction of your society, so that in fact, the vast majority, so in other words, to put it bluntly, what you look like doesn't determine what you get.
Absolutely, absolutely, Josh, because then when we're talking about transformation, we're talking about normalizing our society. Yeah. And probably there has to be that honest conversation that is being held to say it is not just a simple exercise of taking assets from the one and giving, or taking from the rich and giving the poor. We probably maybe have to have an honest conversation with the private sector to make them understand why transformation is important. You see, if you're talking about where we are as a country, let's agree that one of our biggest weaknesses is that we don't have social stability. And you won't have social stability if you don't have domestic equality. So the issue of domestic equality is really a ticking time bomb, that is actually waiting to explode. And until and unless you address that, unfortunately, the social ills, the crime, the issues that we're dealing with are actually not going to be, reined in, and we're never gonna get a handle on it. So we need to therefore, get the private sector to understand that if you invest and you buy into transformation you are actually investing in your own future markets, because the erosion of the tax base is not only bad for government, but it is also bad for the private sector. Because if people have an income, then these disposable income that they have, they are therefore in a position to come into a business to buy your goods and services. But if you're going to be sitting in a country where more than 40% of the population in terms of the expanded definition is unemployed, where you have more people that are unemployed than those that are employed in all the provinces except Gauteng and the Western Cape, it's also bad for business, because therefore it means the customers that are going to be walking into your shop are less. It therefore means you might have to, fire, more people. It means that the revenues that you're going to be making are less. It means that the profits that you're going to be taking are less. It means that your shareholder returns are not going to be what they need to be. So investing in transformation, therefore, is investing in your own future, because it's growing the tax base and therefore growing your own customer base and your own clientele. And maybe if we can have that conversation in that way, it will assist us to see and understand why the transformation project in this country is important.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I've run out of time. There are a whole lot of other issues I would have loved to discuss with you, but time has flown by rather more quickly than I thought it would. Let me say this by way of conclusion. It is wonderful to have such a frank conversation with somebody from the business sector, very refreshing. And I have little doubt that people listening to this are going to have a hell of a lot to talk about. Busi, thank you so much for your time.
Judge, thank you very much. It was a very wonderful discussion, and it's very good to see you.
That's terrific. Stay safe.